Welcome back to Cold Case Christianity. I'm Jay Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about something that might be a bit technical, but I think it's worth examining. And that is, how do we explain life in our universe? Is life in the universe emerging from non-living matter? Is that something that is better explained by natural processes, or is it better explained by the intervention of a God, a deity, an intelligent creative force outside the realm of the physical universe, of the naturalistic universe? Can we get life from nothing more than space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry, or is something more needed? Well, I was at a university recently, and one of the pushback questions I got from a student was, when I offered that the origin of life in the universe is best explained by an intelligent being outside the universe, the pushback I got was, well, wait a minute, as humans, we're learning more and more about the origin of life, and our experiments in the laboratory are helping us to understand how life could emerge from non-life. In fact, he offered several examples of the creation of artificial life in the laboratory as examples of how we might get life without the need for God. And so the question we have today is, if we could create artificial life, or life forms, artificial DNA, whatever you want to call it, if it's the entire system in place or just pieces of the system that we could explain, would any of this eliminate the need for God? Would any of this prove there is no God? And I've offered in a book I wrote called God's Crime Scene, the origin of life as a piece of evidence that has to be explained inside the room, the natural realm of the universe. And I think it is best explained by something outside the room of the natural universe, the realm. And I think that that's an intelligent being that has to assist in the process. And we'll talk about that today. And I want to show you first, so bear with me as we look at a couple of websites that where people are writing about this and talking about the fact that either artificial life breakthroughs are on the horizon, they're nearly in front of us. There are people are writing about this. Even a few years ago, we thought we'd actually be at a place by now where we would be able to create artificial life more robustly than we have. And we even see that people are trying to alter the genetic code and create new DNA and artificial DNA, and see this as potential for therapies in the future. But again, all this is part of a larger process that ultimately might provide us with the ability to create life from scratch in the laboratory. And if we could do that, is that really an evidence then that there is no God? There's no need for God, because we can see how natural processes. Let's ask this question. Do these experiments in the laboratory give us evidence that naturalism is sufficient to create life from non-life? That's something we have to address. So if you're starting to read these articles that are talking about artificial life and the creation of artificial life in the laboratory, I think it is fair for us to say, well, does that pose a threat to our Christian worldview? That's the question we're going to talk about. We'll read an article that was posted online, so forgive me while I look off the screen to my computer here for a second. And it is written by the Washington Post about 7 years ago. So it's great because it's actually going to predict the creation of artificial life in the 3 to 10 year range. So we're right in that range right now. So I think it's relevant, and we'll look at what they say, and then we'll parse through it to see if the claims in this article demonstrate that there really is no need for a creator. And you'll get a sense from reading the article with me or listening to it that really is the kind of the hope of the author and the people doing this work. It's written by Seth Borenstein, and it was written at the Washington Post online. The article is called Artificial Life Likely in 3 to 5 Years. Here's what he says. Around the world, a handful of scientists are trying to create life from scratch, and they're getting closer. Experts expect an announcement within 3 to 10 years from someone in the now little-known field of wet artificial life. Quote, "It's going to be a big deal, and everyone's going to know about it," unquote, said Mark Badal, Chief Operating Officer of Protolife of Venice, Italy, one of those in the race. So there are several firms, I'll step out for a second, there are several firms that are trying to do this, and you get a sense that they're trying to do exactly what he said, create, quote, create life from scratch, unquote. So that's what we're looking at here. That's the effort that's being made. And Protolife of Venice was one of several labs trying to do this work. So here we go. Quote, "We're talking about a technology that could change our world in pretty fundamental ways. In fact, in ways that are impossible to predict." Unquote. Now, let's step out for a second. There's lots of talk about whether this is even ethical, if we're going to start to create artificial life, if we're going to try to modify genetically the life that's here. Is this an ethical procedure? Those debates we're not going to talk about today. I simply want to ask the question, would such experiments then eliminate the need for God as an explanation for life in the universe? So let's go back to the article. Here's what he says. That first cell of synthetic life, made from the basic chemicals in DNA, may not seem like much to non-scientists. For one thing, you'll have to look in a microscope to see it. Quote, creating protocells has the potential to shed new light on our place in the universe, unquote, Bedell said. Quote, this will remove one of the few fundamental mysteries about creation in the universe and our role, unquote. Step out for a second. Can you see just from this article that I'm reading to you that this is much more than just, playing with biology in a lab? There's a metaphysical hope that is on the part of these scientists, a hope that when we actually finish this project, we will have removed a mystery about creation in the universe. In other words, there's some hope that, now look, I think that I think he's right. I think I can actually make a case today, and I will in a minute, that we have removed the mystery, but I suspect he's thinking we've removed the mystery and kind of stripped it of any supernatural implications. When in fact, I think just the opposite is what happens when you do this kind of work, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So back to the article. He says, and several scientists believe man-made life forms will one day offer the potential for solving a variety of problems, from fighting diseases to locking up greenhouse gases to eating toxic waste. But Dow figures there are three major hurdles to creating synthetic life. Let's stop for a second. I think he's spot on about this. There are three hurdles, and I think this is actually helpful for us to examine what would be the minimum kind of definition of life in the universe. I think that's very, very important, because that minimal definition he's kind of going to argue here in a second, as he says these are the three major hurdles, three things you must create in order for life to emerge. Here they are, back to the article. 1, a container or membrane for the cell to keep bad molecules out, allow good ones, and the ability to multiply. 2, a genetic system that controls the functions of the cell, enabling it to reproduce and mutate in response to environmental changes. 3, a metabolism that extracts raw materials from the environment as food and then changes this into energy. Okay. So let's take a break for a second there. You see that what we're looking for when we define life is something that, number one, can sustain itself by metabolizing food, can reproduce. These are the things that are really important. And as you can create, nothing short of that would qualify, I think, and that's really what he's saying here. So let's go another step in the article. He says, one of the leaders in the field, Jack Sozak at Harvard Medical School, predicts that within the next 6 months, scientists will report evidence that the first step, creating a cell membrane, is, quote, not a big problem, unquote. Scientists are using fatty acids in that effort. We'll come back to that in a minute. Sozak is also optimistic about the next step, getting nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA, to form a working genetic system. That also, by the way, has been they've been working on that and done some good work on that, making progress on that. When I say good work, what I mean is they are actually making progress. Whether this is really good or bad or evil or not evil, that's a whole other issue. But you go back to the article. His idea is that once the container is made, if scientists add nucleotides in the right proportions, we'll come back to that too, then Darwinian evolution could simply take over. He says, quote, we aren't smart enough to design things. We just let evolution do the hard work and then figure out what happened, unquote, Sozak says. We'll come back to that. Is that really true? That they aren't designing things? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. In Gainesville, Florida, the article continues, Steve Benner, a biological chemist at the Foundation for Applied Molecular Evolution, is attacking that problem by going outside of natural genetics. Normal DNA consists of 4 bases, adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, known as the ACGT molecules that spell out the genetic code in pairs. Benner is trying to add 8 new bases to the genetic alphabet. Bedell said there are legitimate worries about creating life that could, quote, run amok, unquote, but there are ways of addressing it, and it'll be a very long time before that is a problem, he says. Quote, when these things are created, they're going to be so weak, we'll come back to that, it'll be a huge achievement if you can keep them alive for an hour in the lab, unquote, he said. But, quote, them getting out and taking over, never in our imagination could this happen, unquote. All right, so that's the article we're going to look at, because I think it brings up the same kinds of issues that I see in other articles. I think it hits all the points that are really relevant. And now when we come back from the break, we'll talk about if the points that are described in this article really make a case, which it seems to me that's really where they want to be able to offer, is that some form of naturalism and evolution is sufficient to explain the origin of life in the universe. Let's see if the work they're doing actually makes a case for that, or if it makes a case for just the opposite. Okay, now that you've heard the article, let's talk about whether or not it proves the case that they're trying to make, which is that some form of naturalism and evolutionary processes could account for life in the universe, and that all they have to do is put certain things in place, and then evolution does all the rest of the work, as the article seemed to explain. The first thing I see that really is a difficulty here is that you can tell that the people who are in charge of this, the scientists, are strictly controlling the creative environment in which they hope to have this all happen. They're sterile laboratories. They're control of the environment, the way in which they insert things at certain times and make changes at certain times. This is in a very strictly controlled environment. Why? Because the environment of the early Earth is nothing like laboratories. And so whatever you do in a laboratory is not going to be a reflection of what could happen under naturalism in the environment that would really have to happen in, which is the early Earth's environment. So the first giveaway for us ought to be that they are controlling the environment in a way we can never control. These are sterile environments. You should see what they wear when they do these experiments. These are things that we just don't exist in reality in terms of naturalism. While this may be an experiment to show how life originates, it cannot be an experiment to show how historically life originated. You might be able to say, I could do something today to make life originate, but it has nothing to do with whether it could happen historically, given the environment in which it has to originate. So I think this is really the key, is that they are controlling the creative environment. And they even admit so much. Now, let's go back to the next issue, or start to the next issue, which is, I think, even more difficult to explain. They talked about creating life from scratch. Remember? That was in the article. Well, that's the problem. They are relying on pre-existing scratch. In other words, they've got to start with something. And they're going to start with these scratch chemicals and nucleotides typically, which are, they're jumping ahead of the evolutionary process and selecting material that is much further down the evolutionary process than the very beginning of the universe. If we can't even explain how the scratch they're starting with could be here. It's kind of like that old joke that you'll hear sometimes from the sermons, right, from the pulpit, in which a scientist is kind of challenging God and saying, you know, God, we've gotten pretty good at this, and we can solve all kinds of we could even think now our science is advanced to the point where we could create life the same way you create life. If you could create Adam, we could create Adam also. Really, God says, well, let's have a little contest on that. And he says, I'm game. He says, well, God says, well, you know, we're going to have to start with the same things that I start with, the dust of the earth. And God says, oh, we're going to have to make this from dirt. And so the scientist says, no, okay, I think we got that down. And he reaches down to pick up some dirt to start the process. And God says, no, hang on a minute here. You better get your own dirt. This idea that you have to get your own dirt is kind of part of the joke, but it really exposes a bigger problem. It's absolutely true. Whatever we're starting with, we have to start with something, and we got to explain where that comes from. Now, this is the biggest problem we have, is that to jump into this process pretty far down the line of what would be required to even begin, that's the problem with their scratch. They're not really starting with scratch, because real scratch in the universe would be nothing. No amino acids, no nucleotides, none of the things they're starting with. But they want to jump into that process early. As a matter of fact, there's a good example of this when they talked about they're doing the work on the membrane. Remember, they talked about how they're building the shell of the system, the membrane that's going to protect all the activity in the membrane. And they've created this thing doing what? Well, they said they used fatty acids. Remember? Well, that's the problem. Fatty acids themselves are pretty far down in that evolutionary process if you're going to claim evolution is responsible for this. As a matter of fact, where do you get these things from? Again, this is part of the scratch that they're going to say they're going to start with. This does not explain how we get fatty acids. But once you've got them, now you're going to start to use them in a certain way. Now, that's really important. So far, all we're talking about is just the stuff. You have to have a certain environment and certain kinds of scratch materials, And they're cheating in these areas. They are, number one, starting with an environment that you wouldn't have in the early Earth, and number two, starting with materials, both the pre-existing scratch, got to get your own dirt, and two, fatty acids that you wouldn't have available to you to do this work. And these things you've got to offer somehow. How do I get the scratch? How do I get the fatty acids in the incredibly hostile environment? Remember, he said you couldn't even keep this thing alive an hour with the strict controls of the laboratory. This has got to survive in the hostile environment of the early Earth or in the universe. Come on. Think about that for a second. So now let's take another step in another direction. We talked about the scratch materials, the base materials. Here's another thing they're trying to control. They have to control, and that is the probabilities. They've got to overcome the probabilities. If this is going to occur in a natural environment of the universe without supernaturalism, without creative interaction, well, then you've got to overcome these incredible long odds, because all you got to work with is space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry that govern space, time, and matter. And if that's the case, we've done the numerical statistics on this. What is it that's creating, for example, it's turning amino acids into proteins? How are these coming together in the forms that they are? Is there enough time in the universe, given just nothing but time and physics, to get these things to emerge to where we are today, to start life? There's not enough time in the universe for any of that to occur, and we already know that. So what you do to jump and shorten the odds is you get involved. You start to create. You start to step in to that environment, pick out stuff that and start to manipulate. You start to get actively engaged in the process. That's what these scientists are doing in the laboratory. Why? Because they've got to control the probabilities. Worse than that, they've got to control the proportions and placements. Remember, they've got to create the nucleotides and create the string of nucleotides in artificial DNA, however they're going to do this, because these things are information. These nucleotides tell the cell, tell this life form how to build its proteins, how these proteins interact. It is the framework, the informational code for everything that happens in the organism. And you've got to get in there and start to actually write the code to place these things, because we already know that you can't get these things randomly with just time. And they've already tried to figure out what process of physics could ever place the nucleotides in the DNA molecule in such a way as to have them contain information. We already know the time won't get it done, and physics won't get it done, and now these scientists are proving that there is one thing that could get it done: intelligent interaction. The intelligent interaction of scientists. If there's no scientist, though, doing this at the cosmic level, right, at the origin of the universe and the origin of the planet Earth and the origin of life therein, what is the intelligent interaction that is taking place that could explain this? Well, I think we know, but it doesn't come from scientists and laboratories, especially when you've got to overcome incredibly hostile environments in order to do this. You have no laboratory, you have no scratch, and you don't have, if there's no scientists, you have no intelligence. How does this happen? Well, because there's one thing that can defeat all of this. Supernatural intelligence could actually defeat all of it. Let's go another step. They're also controlling the resulting environment. So once you create this in the sterile lab that isn't a reflection of the early Earth, then you've got to control the environment around it so that it doesn't get damaged in some way. And that is the problem, is that you've got to, like you said, this doesn't live a day, an hour, unless we are micromanaging the process of controlling the environment. Really? How's that going to happen in the natural environment? You're just, again, demonstrating the need for not only a source of all the materials, but a director who is creating and sustaining this thing over time. Here's what it comes down to. You're seeing this word control over and over and over again in this process, aren't you? Well, that should be a tip-off to you, because this level of control is only available from intelligent intervention. If you're going to argue that physics and chemistry can somehow exert the kind of control necessary to create the scratch and then manipulate the way we position everything, proportion everything, and place everything, and then sustain it and protect it, that level of control is not available to physics. But it would be available if there is a loving creator that is interested in its creation enough to both build it and protect it. And if you're going to argue that intelligence and that information rather in this process, and they certainly in the article seem to admit that this is a key ingredient for life in the lab, is DNA intelligence, DNA information rather. Well, where do you get that from? Clearly, they're demonstrating the need for an intelligent agent because they've got to get involved in the DNA process. But what would there be out there? What would be available outside the lab to be the intelligent agent that is engaged in the informational process of DNA? That is the problem. In the end, what the experiments in the lab do is confirm what we already know, that the best explanation for the origin of life in the universe is an intelligent agent that's involved in every step of this process the same way that these intelligent agents have been involved in every step of this process. And that's what I try to describe in the book, God's Crime Scene. Now, as I said, I've written about this issue of artificial life and the fact that it actually demonstrates the need for a creator, and in several website articles at Cold Case Christianity. If you'll just go there and type into the search engine, which is this up here in the top corner with a little magnifying glass, you will find those by just typing in artificial life or typing in information or DNA. You'll start to get those articles popping up. Hope those help you. And of course, if you read down, you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which comes out. Our articles are posted every day, and I will send those to you in your email if you're interested in reading along with us. All right? So now we've had a chance to take a look at why I think that artificial life experiments in the laboratory actually point most reasonably to the intervention of an intelligent agent. And of course, we would say that intelligent agent is God. Hope that helps you to make the case to your friends. And I'll see you right back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.